The Manchin-Schumer agreement, also known as the Inflation Reduction Act, just passed one of its bigger hurdles, which is Senator Kyrsten Sinema. Now, Sinema has just announced that she is willing to sign on to the bill if the Democrats had dropped a certain tax on private investment firms. And of course, what happened? We know they did. Because of course. Sinema announced on Thursday evening that Democrats have agreed to remove the carried interest tax provision. Now, that provision would have not entirely closed the carried interest loophole, but it would have slightly closed, just a tiny little bit, just a tiny crumb of, tax money coming from private equity firms. Now, this loophole, of course, has always allowed billionaires to pay a lower tax rate than average working people. So let me get to an article here from The Lever that said the proposal negotiated by Manchin and Schumer had actually rejected. This is before Sinema stepped in. The party's previous 2021 proposal to fully close a loophole, which would have generated $63 billion in savings. So now that was the original that would have closed it fully. That's how much money they would have gained from it. The new version, before Sinema stepped in, would have only recouped about $14 billion, which effectively preserved the majority of that tax break. But that was too much for Kyrsten Sinema, who is paid for by private equity firms. Now, Sinema, in the last 5 years, has received over $2.2 million in legal bribes, and just recently, $283,000 from the industry in the last cycle. Now, Chuck Schumer also has received about $1.2 million in campaign donations from that industry, from private equity in the last cycle. So now, as soon as Sinema comes in and says, well, I'm not comfortable with taxing private equity firms, well, Chuck Schumer says, okay, throw it overboard. There you go. Hey, there you go. All right, so now, look, they threw it out because, again, they serve the same donors. They both serve private equity. In fact, private equity has delivered $83 million in bribes to Democratic politicians and $62 million in legal bribes to Republicans at the federal level over the last 2 election cycles. Now, if you want to know who runs Congress, you just follow the money. It's the moneyed interests. It's the billionaires, the private equity firms. Now, if you're mainstream media, of course, you never talk about that. You never talk about the role of money in politics. You never talk about how that determines what actually gets through Congress. Now, corporate media, of course, put out fawning coverage of this deal. They claimed it would completely end the loophole. I've got 2 examples of that. On Wednesday, NPR compared the current carried interest language to a 2019 proposal that would have raised about $14 billion over a decade. Neglecting the 2021 proposal that was from Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, which would have raised the full $63 billion over a decade. And last week, Punchbowl News asserted the Manchin-Schumer plan completely eliminated the carried interest loophole, which is not true. Punchbowl also wrote on Wednesday, perhaps the biggest question in the reconciliation process is whether the elimination of the carried interest loophole would make it through Congress. And of course, the answer, of course, was no, it didn't. Other changes to the bill so far involve the 15% minimum corporate tax. They amended that in order to give a carve out for manufacturers so they can save money. Now, interestingly enough, and I'm seeing this comment already. Okay, well, where's the funding going to come from? Because yes, there has to be enough funding for the $300 billion in deficit reduction that Joe Manchin has to have, or else he's going to walk away from the deal. So now we know where that comes from, and that actually is the bright side. So now Democrats decided to replace the loophole provision with an excise tax on corporate stock buybacks. Now, CNN's Manu Raju claims that this tax would bring in more revenue than the carried interest provision, And they did that, again, because if Manchin didn't have his $300 billion in deficit reduction, then he was going to walk. And of course, if the carried interest loophole was kept into place, then Sinema was going to walk. And so here we have a perfect example of special interest versus special interest. Remember, this is not about, and when we talk about, oh, it's Manchin, oh, it's versus Sinema, we're not actually talking about them. They're the faces. But really what we have is a competition between special interests, between industries. And all we're really referring to is the public face that they wear, the mask that they have on. Is it a Sinema mask or is it a Manchin mask? And so in this case, private equity does win, Wall Street wins, the manufacturers win, but people doing massive amounts of stock buybacks, they're not winning. So that's interesting. So now, all told, of course, the Chamber of Commerce is happy with just about all the provisions, except for the excise tax. Of course, they're not going to be happy about that. Sure. But yes, one last thing, by the way, and I think that's really important to note. This hasn't been voted on yet. Now, they're going to vote on this tomorrow. Now, that means there's still a chance for amendments to be brought up. There is still a chance for even this or some other provision to be stripped out or this bill tanked. And so there is a good possibility that even some of the other tax provisions, or I think more importantly, some of the climate change provisions could still be stripped out in order to make up for a shortfall. If, for example, if they reduce or eliminate the excise tax, then they would have to get rid of the equal amount of spending in order to continue to have the $300 billion in deficit reduction. Well, you strip that out, then it becomes even less of a climate bill and more of just corporate handouts for oil and gas companies. So again, this could be bad because it's not over yet. And there is still a chance for this bill, which is already massively watered down, to end up getting worse. Yikes. Look, that's the situation. It's not great. It's pretty bleak. But, that's what's going on. I'm just here to deliver the news.